Yeah. Thank you. All right. Now, your material before the IAP indicates that you've been involved in this project since 2010, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, and your report indicates that you visited the site. On how many occasions have you visited the site, and approximately when did those site visits occur?
Look, I don't recall how many visits in total, but it would have been during the background noise monitoring. And again, I think in 2017, but I don't recall the number of visits.
Okay, so is it a fair summary of that you visited the site on multiple occasions at the time of conducting the initial background noise monitoring in 2010, and again when there was further noise monitoring conducted on the site in 2017?
That's my recollection, yes.
Okay, thank you. And other than those two encounters with the area, have you more recently visited the site?
Not the specific site, no. I have visited areas in the vicinity, but not the particular site.
Okay, thank you. Now, the council's submission indicates that noise associated with wind energy facilities is the single largest concern that council has raised with it in the context of approvals of this kind. And the tribunal has also acknowledged that noise is an area of concern for community members in relation to these kinds of facilities. Is that also your observation, that there is some degree of community concern in relation to noise, the potential for noise from wind energy facilities?
Well, simply looking at the submissions, you can see that that's the case.
Yeah. Okay. And do you agree with the proposition that where in Victoria at least there have been complaints and enforcement issues that have arisen in respect of wind energy facilities, often those kinds of complaints have raised issues in relation to noise and complaints associated with noise from wind energy facilities?
I'm not sure I understand your question, but I'm in terms of enforcement activities, I would certainly agree that there is controversy. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Okay. And at the heart of the Bald Hills nuisance issues that you were previously involved in before the Supreme Court, that also raised issues in relation to noise and noise from wind turbines, didn't it?
It was associated with noise from wind turbines, yeah. Yes.
Okay. To what extent do you agree with the proposition that in that context of significant community concern in relation to noise, both in a pre-approval situation and subsequently, it's important that noise investigations in processes such as this are rigorous and robust, and not just that they are actually rigorous and robust, but that the community perceives them to be rigorous and robust as well?
Well, they certainly need to be rigorous and robust. I don't discount that, but ultimately it's an objective exercise against a set of criteria. So that's the important thing, that the criteria are achieved. Those criteria have been set by experts in health and other things, and so we rely on those experts to provide the criteria. What we must make sure is that our assessments are accurate to demonstrate that those criteria can be achieved. It's very difficult to, but it's very difficult to convince everyone about, I suppose, the technical aspects of acoustics, which many people don't understand. But we need to make sure that our assessments are accurate.
Okay. Do you agree that as part of a technical assessment process such as the one that is being undertaken here, part of the role of the expert technical people is not just to undertake a technically accurate assessment, but also to communicate the details of that technical assessment in a way that addresses, to the extent that it's possible to do so, that community perception and concern?
Yes, it is. And perhaps for your first question, you asked me how many times I've been to the site. I have actually been to the site also for community consultation, which I had forgotten about. But during that community consultation, what we've done is to actually, because a noise level of 40 doesn't mean much to the general public. So what we did is actually play the sound of wind turbines at that level in the overall acoustic environment so people could understand what that sounds like. So we have conducted that to try to demonstrate to people what noise levels they should perceive that there will be. And yes, I agree that that's part of our role.
Okay. As part of the work that you've done, is it the case that you have had regard to the planning scheme provisions as they relate to this particular location and this particular kind of facility informing your opinions, or is it the case that you've more focused on considerations of the New Zealand noise standard?
Well, the planning provisions obviously include reference to the New Zealand standard, and there is a requirement that an assessment be conducted in accordance with the New Zealand standard. And so that's why we have had regard to the planning scheme. And then I suppose as a result of that, we've conducted an assessment in accordance with New Zealand standard.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you were asked some questions yesterday in relation to the Bald Hills decision. And no doubt that will be the subject of submissions, probably by all of the parties further down the track. But I wondered, as a consequence of the part that you played in that proceeding and the court's findings, whether you've reflected on the views that you expressed in that decision, the court's findings, and whether from that you've reflected on any learnings that there might be from that decision in the context of the work that you undertake in a case like this.
Sure, thank you. Well, the Bald Hills Wind Farm was about noise monitoring post-construction. And so there are two important factors here. Firstly, it was based on the 1998 New Zealand standard. That's now superseded and has no role in this. The important aspects from what I did for that case was to conduct measurements to determine whether I believed the now superseded standard was complied with, as well as some very specific conditions, permit conditions. What the court found is that acoustic engineers shouldn't to try to work out what the New Zealand standard is trying to achieve generally, and therefore conduct measurements in a way that are not specifically contemplated by the New Zealand standard. And so as a result of that, we look at the exact words of the New Zealand standard and we put into place those things. Now, those things really relate to compliance monitoring more so than predictions prior to construction. But certainly there have been changes as a result of that I've put in place to make sure we carefully read the New Zealand standard. We may not agree with all parts of it, but we we make sure that we do things entirely in accordance with that standard.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to then ask you some questions in relation to background noise. Tribunals and panels have commented in the context of these kinds of cases on the importance of establishing background noise levels, and said that it is that the background noise levels are critical and a foundation upon which the acceptable noise levels modelled compliance assessment and post-construction compliance and enforcement rests. And I assume that you would agree with that as a proposition.
It's generally, I would agree with that as a proposition, except in the case whereby base levels are set and are accepted, in which case the background noise levels are not needed to determine the criteria.
I understand that that's your position, and I'll take you to some questions in relation to that.
Sure.
But I was asking you, as a matter of generality, do you agree with the description of background noise levels as being critical and a foundation upon which these other measures that we make rest?
Well, again, it really depends what they're being used for. If they're being used to determine criteria, yes, they're crucial. If they're not being used to determine criteria, then what they're being used for is to try to understand the general acoustic environment. And in those circumstances, they're not as important, because we all know it's a rural environment with generally low background noise levels, other than in some particular circumstances.
Okay.
So I would agree that they are generally important for determining criteria if they're used for that.
Okay. Now, in this case, we're reliant on background noise assessments that were undertaken in 2010, which is 12 years ago. That's the case, isn't it?
Well, we're not relying on them, but I understand that they're the ones that have been done and presented to the panel.
Okay. Did you make any recommendations to your client about undertaking current background noise measurements beyond the recommendation that's in the joint statement of the acoustic experts that background noise levels should be conducted prior to construction?
Well, it has been an ongoing discussion, certainly. One of the problems that we have at this site is that there is the MacArthur wind farm to the north. And the most important thing when you're conducting background noise monitoring is to make, for the purpose of determining criteria, is that you don't include the noise from the MacArthur wind farm. And so while it would have been the easy thing to go out and remeasure background noise levels, if that noise included some component from the MacArthur wind farm, then the criteria for this wind farm would have been raised, and that wouldn't be appropriate. And so that's why my suggestion has been not to conduct background noise levels, particularly in the area around the MacArthur wind farm. Now, that was particularly the case more so when we were considering a layout which was much closer to MacArthur. In the current circumstances, the closest turbine's around 7 kilometres away, in which case those background noise levels could be done, but the best time for that to be done is immediately prior to construction. And that's been my recommendation.
Okay, so the answer to the question, did you make any recommendations about conducting more current background noise measurements, is no, because your recommendation has been in accordance with what's set out in the joint statement. Is that the case?
Well, yes, that is my recommendation, what's in the joint statement.
Okay. Paragraph 4.2 of your report, you refer to pre-construction background noise monitoring undertaken at 4 residences from October 2017 to February 2018. And do you observe that that included noise from MacArthur, as you've indicated in your previous answer? That information hasn't been made publicly available. Is it correct to assume that you have had access to that background noise levels that was undertaken more recently?
I certainly do have access, yes.
Okay. And from that information, are there any learnings that you have been able to ascertain, either about the levels of noise associated with the MacArthur wind farm, or about changes to background noise levels in the location of those 4 dwellings?
Well, there was only one of the dwellings which was repeated from the original assessment, and at that dwelling, the noise levels, and that was well away from MacArthur, and the noise levels at that dwelling were similar but marginally higher than what we measured in 2010. For the others, they were really just generally in line with the other measurements that have been taken. There was nothing which stood out as anything different.
Okay. Now I wanted to then confirm that the reason that you've expressed the view that the 2010 measurements of background noise is sufficient is on the basis that the background noise levels would be sufficiently low so as not to warrant an increase above the minimum applicable level of 40 dBA. That's the case, isn't it?
Well, there are two things. Firstly, it is in accordance with the New Zealand standard. There is nothing in the New Zealand standard that wasn't done at that time. And as we pointed out, Bald Hill says we follow the standard without trying to change things about it. So it is in accordance with the standard. The standard doesn't say how long it needs to be between background noise measurements. But secondly, as you've said, because it's not being used to determine the criteria, there is no need at this time to have those measurements repeated, but I have recommended that they be repeated prior to construction.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree that that approach assumes that an assessment of background noise levels will result in an increase in the noise limit rather than a decrease?
Well, in accordance with the New Zealand standard, you can't decrease the noise as a result of the background noise levels.
Okay. To what extent do you agree with the proposition that accurate and current assessments of background noise are also contemplated for by the New Zealand standard for assessment of whether something is in an area is a high amenity noise location?
Well, certainly it is one way, towards the bottom of the hierarchy of determining a high amenity area, but there's nothing in there that describes contemporary measurements. It certainly describes background noise measurements and one method of conducting that assessment.
Mm-hmm. To the extent that the New Zealand standard lays out a process for determining whether something is a high amenity area, and I'm looking in particular at the part of the standard that is C 5.31. Have we got sufficient information available in relation to this to make an assessment about whether this is an area where there are special circumstances that might warrant a more stringent noise level?
Yes, I outlined that in my statement that we have conducted an assessment of that in accordance with those C 5.3.1, and it demonstrated that a high amenity area, if you were to use that methodology, which I don't think in this case is warranted, but even if you use that methodology, the high amenity area is not warranted.
Are you familiar with the tribunal decision in 2018 from the Narrogid wind energy facility?
I haven't read it, but I'm aware of some of the outcomes of it.
Okay, I might save my questions about that for Mr. Evans, who was, I think, one of the witnesses in that case. Just continuing on the question of the background noise levels, your report indicates that the noise levels, the background noise monitoring was undertaken pursuant to the 2010 standard, even though at the time, I think that the time of it all is that the New Zealand standard became the standard in March 2010. The planning scheme in Victoria was amended to refer to the 2010 standard in January 2011, and your noise monitoring was undertaken in the period between the standard coming into operation and the planning scheme changing to refer to that. Is it it's your report and the other acoustic experts seem to proceed on the basis that you actually use the measurement technique for noise monitoring, background noise monitoring in the 2010 standard. Is that the case?
Well, at the time, there was obviously a change of what was being conducted. And so we did the assessment in accordance with both. We did it in accordance with the 1998 standard, if that were to be the one that we would use. And we did it in accordance with the 2010 standard. And in particular, there's a change to the descriptor, which is used between 1998 and 2010. And that's the change from the L95 descriptor to the L90 descriptor. So we did both and have conducted the results in accordance with the L90, which is the 2010 version, as well as all of the other requirements of the 2010 standard.
Okay, and as I understand it, those noise measurements were based on the proposed hub height at that time, which was 80 metres, and you've then made a calculation based on wind shear to update that those figures to account for the change in the hub height that's now proposed. Is that the case?
Well, it's the case, apart from that we didn't do the change to the wind shear. The wind shear was provided to us by Wind Prospect, and then we recorrelated the data against the wind speed data, which is reference to the current proposed hub height.
Okay. In his peer review work, Mr. Evans comments upon the use of a single data set against wind speed of the kind that I think was shown to you yesterday by Mr. Fetter, and that best practice would involve having information or analysis available so that you could understand what was happening with background noise levels separately to what might be happening during the day. I think that you said in answer to a question from Mr. Fetter that you had that raw data and that had been provided. Have you undertaken any analysis of that data in order to understand or what differences, or whether there are differences in the night period versus the daytime period from the material that you've got in 2010?
No, I don't believe we have.
Okay. Do you agree that in an environment like this, where I might withdraw that and start again. It seemed to be your evidence yesterday when Mr. Fetter asked you some questions about the nighttime and daytime periods that you weren't convinced that the nighttime noise levels in an area like this would be lower than the daytime noise levels. Is that a correct understanding of the evidence that you gave yesterday?
Well, in some circumstances it will, in some circumstances it won't. And the reason I say that is that intermittent noise sources are removed from the L90 levels. So it's only the continuous noise which is included. So things that occur mostly during the day, cars moving, farming activity, things of that nature are excluded from the measurements, but in continuous noise, things like wind in trees and potentially insects, which may be continuous and therefore it would be more potentially, the insects in particular would be more prevalent at night. So I'm not saying that it won't be, but I'm just saying it's not certain that it would be.
Okay. So, and in this case, you don't have enough information, or you haven't done the level of analysis that would enable you to tell us whether which of those circumstances this site is.
That's true. The only analysis of the evening and nighttime was in accordance with that C5.3.1 that we did, which assesses the high amenity area during the evening and the nighttime.
Okay. In relation to that, as I understand the joint statement, the three acoustic experts all agree that Orford and the area of Orford that's in the township zone is appropriately designated as a high amenity area, but the areas that are in the farming zone ought not to be. Is that the case?
No, that's not the case. The New Zealand standard says that you shouldn't consider any area which is outside of the 35 dBA contour. And as Orford is predicted, the noise level predicted at Orford is less than 30, is therefore outside the 35 dBA contour and shouldn't be considered to be a high amenity area.
Okay, perhaps let's put it around a slightly different way. If parts of Orford were in the 35, is it 35 or 30?
35.
35 dBA area, everybody agrees that because they're in the township zone, they would be in a high amenity area. Is that the case?
No, I think there's a hierarchy. So the first thing you look at is the township zone. That is an area which could be a high amenity area. So then you go to the next thing. Is it within the 35 contour? No, it's not, but let's say that it was.
Yeah, just say it is.
Then we go to the next thing would be to do the assessment in accordance with C5.3.1.
Okay. As I understand your position, based on what I think you described yesterday as the planning and policy guideline direction in relation to high amenity and the direction to consider the Cherry Tree Wind Farm decision, you've taken the view that the farming zone land is not to be treated as a high amenity zone. Is that the case?
Well, there are a number of factors that come into that decision. The first is the planning scheme itself, the New Zealand standard itself, which says that the planning scheme must promote a higher level of amenity for the zone. I don't believe it does. Secondly, there's the EPA recommendation that the farming zone not be considered a high amenity area. And then thirdly, there's the DELP document, the policy and planning guidelines, which refer back to the Cherry Tree VCAT decision, and that suggests that a farming zone is not a high amenity area.
Okay. To what extent, those are the factors that lead you to the conclusion that the farming zone land is not in a high amenity area. To what extent do you regard that position as being somewhat counterintuitive when you have regard to, say, a township like Orford, where there's multiple dwellings and, you know, the business of people living in the township, compared to what, at least for city people like me, appears to be a very quiet, settled landscape in a rural setting?
Well, the requirement is to consider what is principally promoted in those zones. So what is principally promoted essentially in the farming zone is primary production. Now, although people obviously live there, and they live there for various reasons, including to be in a rural environment, what's principally promoted is primary industry, and primary industry is not necessarily a quiet activity. So I don't think it's counterintuitive at all.
Okay. Can I then ask you some questions in relation to cumulative noise impact? You're no doubt aware that clause 1901-2R of the Moyne Planning Scheme directs consideration or calls for planning and sustainably manage the cumulative impacts of alternative energy development. You're aware of that provision?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. And do you agree that it provides on its face no particular direction as to how cumulative impacts associated with wind energy, alternative energy development is to occur?
In itself, it doesn't, but it does refer to the New Zealand standard. And the
Okay.
New Zealand standard does talk about the total noise achieving the criteria.
Okay. Do you agree also with the proposition that the planning and policy guidelines that are the reference document in the planning scheme, whilst they provide some guidance in relation to cumulative impact assessment in relation to some disciplines in the noise context, provides really no detail other than to direct us to the mechanism that's provided in the New Zealand standard?
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay.
The New Zealand standard is the key, I think.
The 2010 was obviously an important year from the wind energy facilities position, because not only was it when you did the background noise monitoring in this case, but it was also when the New Zealand standard came into force. To what extent do you think that the New Zealand standard, as it was written at that time, envisaged the clustering of wind energy facilities that's currently occurring in Moyne, especially in the western cluster of this area that's shown on figure MB 102 in the map book?
Well, it does envisage it, and it requires that the total noise achieve the criteria. And in some ways, when you consider a residence, whether it's one wind farm that is has, I suppose, contributes to the noise at that residence, or whether it's 2 or 3 or 4, it's the level which is important. And so it has assessed, it has considered that situation.
Okay. Is it a fair summary of the position in relation to the way that the New Zealand standard deals with cumulative impacts to say that it says, provided that the noise levels don't go beyond the 40 decibel noise limit that's contemplated, cumulative effects of multiple wind energy facilities on the same dwelling will be acceptable?
Yes, that's my understanding. Yes.
Okay. And what that is effectively doing is doing that exercise that I think you and Mr. Fetter did yesterday of the logarithmic addition, and saying this is where we get to, provided it doesn't go above that 40 line, then everything will be okay.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, okay. And is it also fair to say that it doesn't make any, it doesn't give any guidance or time period over which that noise level is acceptable? That is, it essentially says you can add that level of noise at the 40 decibels over whatever period in the 24-hour day, and that will still be acceptable?
Yes, that's right, because whether it be from multiple wind farms or a single wind farm, you can have turbines in multiple directions. For example, if you look at the residence D11, you'll see that it has turbines in most directions, and therefore will have noise from turbines will be audible in those multiple directions. And so that's what the standard tells us to do, to consider that. Now, having said that, the assumptions that have been made are based on the wind in all directions at the same time, which is a worst case and obviously not a realistic situation. So although the assumption is that the wind is in all directions at the same time and the 40 dBA limit is achieved, in reality, the total level will be lower than that because the wind will only be in one direction.
Okay. But it would be possible for a dwelling to be located, for instance, between this facility and a facility like Woolsthorpe, for instance, where there is an extended period of operation of the wind energy facility creating noise as a consequence of wind coming from different directions, either seasonally or in a day, wouldn't it?
Yes, that's right. So whilst the levels from both wind farms will be lower, there is the potential for the audibility of wind turbine noise to be more often.
Okay. And when you when you're doing those kinds of cumulative impact assessments, do you have regard to, sorry, I'm just getting to the right stage of the so that's dealt with at 5.6 in the New Zealand standard, and what it indicates is that the that when you are, as you're assessing a wind farm, you're discounting or excluding the noise from the existing wind farm facility. Is that the case?
Well, that is the case for background noise. So what it says is that, let's say you measure the background noise level and at 6 meters a second, say, the background noise level is 35. Another wind farm comes along and then the noise when you measure the background might be, say, 37. What you need to do is to make sure you use the 35 to determine the criteria, not the 37. That is, the increase in noise associated with the existing wind farm should not increase the overall noise level. And that's the reason why we haven't conducted continuous background monitoring after the installation of or the construction of the Macarthur wind farm.
And so where you've got a facility like Macarthur that is operating,
yes,
and you're seeking to make an assessment of cumulative noise impacts, are you accessing data of actual operational wind farm noise, or are you reliant upon other data from predictive data?
In the main, we're considering the predictive data, and that's because the measurements by necessity have to include the noise from the wind farm as well as the existing noise in the environment. So what we do is to consider the predictive levels, but we have also had a look through and considered whether it seems to be consistent with the measurements. And as far as we can tell, and it's not a precise exercise, but as far as we can see, that is the case.
Okay, so in relation to that data, are you acting for the wind farm operator at Macarthur, and is that where you're getting the data from?
No, that's not the case.
Okay, so how are you, do you approach the wind farm operator and get data from them, both the predictive data prior to construction, and then the operational data?
In terms of the predictive data, I can't recall the exact way that it was done, but we were able to work out where the turbines were and what model it is, and therefore work out the sound power levels. And then in terms of the post-construction monitoring, we were able to access a report, and I don't recall whether we got that from publicly available information or whether it was provided to us. It was some years ago, and I don't recall how we got it.
So is it the case that when you're doing your cumulative assessment in respect of an already operational wind farm, you either do your own predictive modelling based on information that you are able to put together from the location of the turbines, the turbine type and the like?
That's my preferred approach, certainly, to do it that way, because that way you can put it into the noise model and you can show what the combined noise is from both wind farms.
Okay. To what extent is that withdraw that? Do you agree with the proposition that if you were able to have access to actual operational noise reports from an operating wind farm, that would give you a greater degree of accuracy in relation to your cumulative impact assessment, because you're only predicting one limb of the cumulative impact?
Yes. Well, I think there's a couple of things to say there in terms of the accuracy and access to the information. We did have access to some information, and we have used that as a cross-check. But secondly, in terms of the accuracy, what we need to take into account is that the wind farms are 7 kilometres away. In those circumstances, the noise levels from one are not going to have any significant impact of a person near those areas. The levels are going to be extremely low, and they're not going to contribute in any significant way at any residence which is anywhere near the criterion of 40. And this is not a situation where, there's a residence between the two, which is, 37 prediction from one and 38 from another, and you're right on the borderline of 40. Residences which are between the two wind farms will have somewhere in the order of 25 from each, and therefore the predicted level will be somewhere around 28, some 12 decibels below the 40 limit.
Sorry, I'm just going back and checking. I think I've covered nearly all of my questions. You, in your evidence yesterday, indicated that you'd been undertaking these kinds of noise assessments for wind energy facilities over more than 20 years. To what extent have you been able to use that experience and observations that you've been able to make, both of what you predicted and what actually happens in operation, to discern a trend or the relationship between predicted noise levels and actual operational noise level?
Well, we've done exactly that, and in that way, we have refined the way that we do predictions. For example, the 1998 standard had a particular prediction methodology based on measurements we took. We never used that prediction methodology because it under-predicted the noise levels. But with the current methodology we have for predictions, we're very confident that the levels are marginally conservative that we predict, and that when we go back and conduct the measurements, that they are either equal to or lower than those levels.
Do you agree with the proposition that that data is useful to have, and that having that kind of publicly available trend analysis in relation to the multiple investigations that have now been undertaken would be helpful from a community perception point of view, bearing in mind the questions I put to you at the start of the cross-examination about noise issues and wind farms?
Yes, I think it would, and these sort of things typically are not. The summaries are not typically public documents. And it's not that they're confidential necessarily, but they're more so seen in acoustic conferences that the general public don't attend, more so than things that the public would have an opportunity to see. But certainly there'd be some value in correlating the predicted levels and measured levels to determine whether the predictions are accurate.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall. Member West.
Thank you. Morning, Mr. Turnbull.
Morning.
You're okay there, as long as you can hear me and it can be recorded. Can I refer you to your statement of evidence, document 032, and do you have that there?
Yes, I do.
That's good. I'll just share the screen so that we can all have a look at it. This is very interesting information. This was provided by you, Mr. Turnbull, on request of the tribunal, the panel, sorry. This is measurements at resident D15. Is that what you can see? Everyone can see?
Yes.
And this is a time plot, and it's at 19th of October, excuse me, to the 10th of November in 2010. And this shows you the variation between hourly variations and parameters such as LEQ, L90 and Lmax, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. It's squeezed up, so it's a bit hard to see, but we can sort of use our imagination here. For some reason I can't get, there we go. So if we have a look at, and this is for D15. Now, if I take you to D15, that's down here, which is on the Woolsthorpe Road. Is that the Hayward Woolsthorpe Road? Or the... Yep, Woolsthorpe Hayward Road. Is that right? D15 is this one here, which
Yes.
you can see my indicator on. I didn't choose this for any specific reason, it just happened to be there. But it does show the hourly variations and how, I'll expand it up, how at night time the noise levels get down to about 20 decibels, is that right?
Yes.
And it's fairly consistent. In fact, it gets down to less than 20, which is about the floor of the instrument. Is that about right?
Yeah, floor is somewhere in the order of 18.
Okay. So what can you tell us about the relationship between this is L90, by the way, the green line, and the blue line is LEQ. Now, the blue line follows the green at night time quite well. What do you see in that relationship?
It's certainly in terms of the correlation between the green and the blue, that at the night time they do follow each other very closely, which indicates that there's very little intermittent noise in this case. and that the levels are very low at night.
That's right. And being a low LEQ means, what would you say that low LEQ means?
It means there's no very little intermittent noise,
Very little, sorry.
very little intermittent noise, and low background levels.
Right. So, and there, that I can't see what the L max is, but that's probably rather relevant. And this is, I'll take back out again, relatively night after night after night throughout the measurement period. It's the L90 is below or around about 20. That's right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. I love these diagrams because they show you all sorts of other things that's happening. What was happening in this period here, do you think?
I suspect it was a high wind event.
A high
Wind event?
similarly over in this period over here?
Quite possibly, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. West, could you just describe for those listening online what period you're talking about on the graph?
Sorry. This period between 30th October 2010 and 1st of November 2010. That's what you'd expect for a high wind period.
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay. So this clearly shows that during the night period, which I assume is what these lines are, it's around about midnight, that at night time at this location, it's relatively quiet.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Would you say 20 decibels L90 is very quiet, or?
Not throughout the whole night period, but it does get down to 20 frequently, yes.
Yeah. And during the day, the L90 looks like it variable, very variable. Can be, for example, in this period here on 30th October, it's up around 40 something decibels. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's, you wouldn't know what that's from. Simply as that, it could be the insects, farming activity, wind, anything.
Yes, well, the L90 is close to the LEQ, so it's some sort of consistent noise. So it's unlikely to be farming activity, and because of the time it extends over. It could be any other noise that's consistent.
These plots provide a lot of interesting information. That's why I asked. Similarly on this one here, which is in your report of the background noise measurements, looks like report in October 2021. It shows low background levels as well, below 20, and corresponding wind levels and things like that. Go on to, so if we look at measurement location and Woolsthorpe Hayward Road is a main, I don't think it's an arterial road, but a main road, a major main road in the area. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Look, I would expect intermittent traffic along, albeit being a main road for the area.
Yeah. So if you look at your location D37, you did noise measurements D37 and D49, which is this one up in here. That's on the Kangatong Road. Is that right, Mr. Turnbull?
Well, I'm not going to argue with you, but I don't know the area as well as you, I don't think.
Yeah. So we go down to D37 and D49. They're fairly similar. And these show a different background noise level at night time.
Yes.
Very much so.
Yes.
So D37 only gets down to around about 30 decibels at night time.
Yeah, certainly around that area, low 20, high 20s, sorry.
And D49 similarly It's gets down to 25s.
Yes,
It sits about there. So this is Kengurton Tong Road is not a main road. Is that right?
I assume it's not. I haven't heard
I
of it.
don't think it is. Can you explain why Kengurton Road has higher, or the noise measurements of Kengurton Road are higher generally than on the Woolsthorpe Hayward Road?
Well, the noise measurements really have very little to do with the road traffic, particularly the L90. I would expect that this one probably has more tall trees, and so the wind in the trees is likely to be a bigger influence than other areas, as well as there may be some other activity in the area, such as insects, birds, etc.
Okay. So that, but I'll just take you to the definition. This is from Federal Highways Authority, US, and it just happened to be a convenient definition I pulled up. And this is the, I'll go and share that. I haven't pulled that up. Why hasn't that come up? Technology. There we go. That talks about L90 as a statistical descriptor of the sound levels exceeded for 90% of the time. I'll just read this one out. This is considered to represent the background noise level without the source in question. So we're talking about if it was near a road, it would be without the road traffic. If it's near a wind farm, it would be out without the wind farm. Is that correct?
No, not in that circumstance. It's correct for a road in terms of a road with intermittent traffic. It's certainly not true of a road with continuous traffic. And in terms of a wind farm, when the noise at residences is more constant, the L90 is used to measure the noise from the wind farm.
Right. So it goes on to say where the noise emissions from a source of interest, could be wind farm or insects or something like that, are constant, such as a fan, an air conditioner, or a pool pump. So this is something like a fan that goes 24 hours a day. It becomes part of the background.
Yes.
And the ambient noise levels has a degree of variability. For example, due to traffic noise, the L90 descriptor may adequately describe the noise source, and a fan or a pool pump.
Yes.
If you've got a wind farm nearby, that's, and I'm saying, wind farms are variable, but if it's constant wind farm noise at one of those locations, and the wind farmer's noise is 24 hours a day, for example, would that form the L90?
Yes, there is the potential for it to do that.
Yeah. So that could
that's
then,
the one. Sorry.
So depending on your modelling and everything like that, and that could then increase the noise levels. For example, in this situation, probably not so much. Would that be correct? If you had a wind farm imposed on your L90 in there, if it was Macarthur, and this is at D49 on Kangleton Tong Road, would Macarthur change your L90 to a fair bit there if it was a constant northerly wind source?
I don't know the distance, I'm sorry, between D39. I think I'll
Sorry, D49 is on Kangleton Road. I can show you that. There it is relative there. And I think I've got you modelling. No, I don't. There it is. So D49 is around about, that's D15, there's D49. Around about there, and that's in the, that looks like the 30 to 35 contour
Yes,
for MacArthur.
yeah, well that,
So that could, okay, where's some of these? That could change your background at D49.
yes, that's correct.
Would it change it significantly?
Well, it would depend on the circumstances. What you've asked me to consider is a constant northerly wind.
Yep.
And in those circumstances, yes, it would.
It's what, sorry, I missed that.
In those circumstances, it would change the background. But in more realistic situation where northerly wind is only one of the wind directions, it would have some impact, but not a significant impact.
Right.
And the impact obviously would be greater at higher wind speeds than it is at lower wind speeds.
And your modelling, Dan, your modelling for MacArthur is the same as Woolthorpe, and that's at 11 metres per second wind speed.
Yes, that's right.
That's right. So that's at high wind speed. Thank you for that, and thank you for providing that information. I think it's about the only information I've ever got on wind farm noise as such. Most other wind farm DESs don't show us these traces, which is, these are very informative. I think we've covered a lot. Do you, in your opinion, do you think the determination from Cherry Tree VCAT decision is still relevant, given we've had new guidelines, new standards, changes in the EPA Act, changes in regulations and things like that over time as we've developed more knowledge of wind farms? Do you think Cherry Tree is still a relevant decision for not only us, this panel, but future panels?
Well, it's relevant in that it's been confirmed by both EPA and DELP. If it were standing on its own and EPA and DELP had said, don't worry about Cherry Tree, here's the way we want to proceed now, then I would say that it has little relevance. But in terms of what the EPA, both EPA and DELP have come back and said, this is the way it should be assessed, that is, farming zones should not be in a high amenity area. I think that it has confirmed what Cherry Tree says. So in itself, the assessment may not be as important as what the authorities have since determined to be the appropriate approach.
I asked whether, do you think, not whether the authorities think, but that's okay. Given that you've got this variation here, nighttime to daytime, a farming zone is an active zone, and it makes certain assumptions. Would you think that farming zones shouldn't be treated as having reasonable amount of amenity at nighttime, given that we have very low background noise levels at nighttime?
Well, they certainly need a reasonable level of amenity, but whether it's the highest level of amenity is really the question, and whether that highest level of amenity is reserved for locations which are specifically designed for that highest level of amenity. But it certainly needs to be provided a high level of amenity, and so it needs to achieve appropriate criteria set down, for example, by the World Health Organization guidelines, and which is envisaged in the New Zealand standard.
It seems, you know, you could draw the conclusion that it's a little bit discriminatory to residents in farming zones, that they aren't awarded a higher amenity, even though they do have an existing high amenity.
Well, I'm not certain that you would say they have an existing high amenity. Well, perhaps not the highest amenity. The assessment in accordance with C.5.3.1, which was at a different location, obviously, indicated that it should not be considered a high amenity area. But certainly they need a high level of amenity, whether it's the highest level is really the question.
Thank you. We can discuss this all day. Moving on to the modelling. Your modelling input, design, equipment is a Vestas. You're fairly confident in the input for that specific turbine that could be installed or may not be installed, but is
Yes,
there
I
much
am.
variability in the measured sound power levels for you to use in your inputs? I mean, does one turbine differ in noise output compared to the next one on the production line and the next one?
No, there's not a significant variation. I've done a lot of measurements of sound power levels in accordance with the IEC standard, and certainly for Vestas machines, I've never found one that is above their specification.
So I think I read in your evidence somewhere that you use the sound power level that you used is representative of a level which would include all the the variability that can be used. Is that correct?
Well, that's right. The Vestas put their levels out, and that's a level that they're prepared to commit to, and so they won't be committing to a level that they can't achieve, or that the variation in their turbines can't achieve.
True. So there's no errors associated with input. Concowie model and ISO model, they have inherent errors in their outputs.
They do, and that's why it's important to have conservative assumptions to make sure that error is on the negative side, if you understand what I'm saying, rather than on the positive side. So rather than plus or minus 5, have it at plus 0, minus 10, rather than plus or minus 5.
So if it's plus or minus 5 and you've got a bell curve, statistical bell curve, you've moved that bell curve up to 0 and 10.
That's right.
So tell me, what does that mean?
Well, it means that at some times the noise level will be much lower than we have predicted. We're not trying to predict the most likely noise level. We're trying to predict the highest noise level. And so there will be many occasions where the noise level is significantly lower. For example, when the wind is not directly downwind from all turbines, which is unlikely to be the case ever. So that's one of the things that puts in place this a factor of safety effectively. And then the inputs to the model are other things that are used to make sure that we predict the highest level rather than the most likely.
Just out of interest, the modelling height for the hub was 169 metres. Is that a measured height from the meteorological towers installed, or is that extrapolated from other data?
Sorry, do you mind repeating that question? I'm not sure.
Sorry, there was probably several questions in one. The hub height that you used for your modelling?
Yes.
What height was that?
Sorry, I just need to go back to.
I think it's 169. You might want to check that.
So the predictions are being based on a hub height of 149 metres.
Sorry,
149.
Okay. And was that from wind speed directions measured at 149?
Well, in terms of the predictions, we place the noise source at that height, and then do the predictions on that basis. That is, the source is at that height, and that provides some input, for example, to the ground effect, which is not very much when you've got a source that high, and also to the distance, obviously, to resonances, and so therefore the noise reduction. So in terms of the prediction of noise, that's what has been done.
So where did the wind speed how can I say this? What's the highest point of the measured wind speed and direction that you had available to you?
Are you now talking about the background noise levels?
Yeah.
Well, for background noise levels, something a little different has been done in a conservative way. We've done the background noise levels, we have correlated against a wind speeds at a height of 169 metres.
That's where that came from.
Yes.
Yep.
And so whilst the actual measured level of wind speeds, I think, was lower than that, they have been effectively what we call sheared, that is using the wind shear equation, taken up to that height of 169 metres.
Thank you. And of course, there's some errors involved in the wind speed measurements and things like that.
Well, yes, there are obviously some potential errors in that, where the measurement is and those sorts of things.
And these are additive errors in your modelling that just...
Well, no, to be clear, it's not in the noise model. That's only in the background noise assessment.
That's right. In your noise model, you used 100% soft ground, is that correct?
For the Konkawi noise model, yes.
Yeah. And in the ISO, it's 50%?
That's right.
And you didn't get much difference between the two models?
I think the Konkawi model was slightly more conservative. That is, predicted higher noise levels for most residences.
And the South Australian guidelines recommended a soft ground factor of what?
The South Australian guidelines, the current guidelines provide an acceptable methodology, which is described by the IOA, the Institute of Acoustics in the UK. That recommends the ISO model with a 50% hard ground. In fact, all of the inputs to that recommendation in what's called the Good Practice Guide are the ones that I've used.
And what would you regard a, say, pasture in summertime in February? It's been 40 degrees days and days and days, dry as a bone. What would you regard that sort of surface? Soft? Hard?
Well, it depends on the noise model being used. So for the Konkawi model, the manual for the Konkawi model says that land should be considered soft, that is, ground with a finite acoustic impedance, and reserves the hard ground for water and asphalt or concrete.
So something that's, yeah, really. And the difference between 100% absorptive and zero absorptive is what in decibels? What will it add?
It's in the order of 4, I would expect. I don't know the number off the top of my head. I haven't done that calculation.
And that would be, if you assumed hard ground, that would be absorbed by your conservative approach to your modelling.
Well, yes. I mean, in terms of the measurements using the soft ground, for example, I mean, it's different for different models, and I suppose we provide inputs for wind farms which work appropriately for wind farms, and have been demonstrated to work correctly. So yes, in terms of the Konkawi model, there is enough conservatism to cover some slight changes in the actual ground effect that you might have. So it assumes essentially what is, when we say soft ground, it assumes ground with a finite acoustic impedance. But as I said before, because the source height is so high, the ground effect is not great for wind farms, because the distance between the sound travelling, the path of the sound that travels, and the ground is so great that the ground effect is not much.
That gives me another one. Another question. You mentioned, I think it was yesterday. Yeah, it was yesterday. The modelling limitations in distance for Concowie is 2 kilometres, wasn't it?
That's what it states. I think it's important to understand that by the distance of 2 kilometres, the noise has reduced below typically 35. And so whilst from an information perspective, it might be important to try to understand what happens beyond that, it's not a factor in terms of compliance because it's only at the distances whereby the residences are well under the criteria.
And the ISO model, what's the limitations, distance limitations on that?
Look, I don't know off the top of my head what it might say, but although these limitations are described in terms of that's where the measurements have currently been conducted to, there's no reason to suggest the same parameters are not valid at greater distances than that.
Okay. In your modelling, you used temperature and humidity inputs of, here we go, memory.
10%.
10 degrees for Concowie and 7%, wasn't it? 70%?
I think Concowie might have been
80.
80, yes.
80. Okay, it's 40 degrees and 10% humidity. What would that effect
That would
have on your modelling output?
it would result in lower predicted noise levels. So 10% and 80 is pretty much worst case. Sorry, 10 degrees and 80% is pretty much the worst case. That is the lowest air absorption that you can get.
Okay.
So it's the most conservative approach.
And that's for both models because the ISO used, ISO says 70% humidity.
That's right. That was to match the good practice guide. So normally we would use the most conservative, which is 10 and 80, but to match the good practice guide, we use 10 and 70, which is not significantly different in any way between 10 and 80.
Okay, can I take you back to this diagram again? And if I've got this location at D15, which is on the Woolsthorpe Hayward Road, if I have a, what's the modelled noise level there? I've got this blown up too much, can't see it. So that's D15, so I drop that down. Whoops. That's, let's just say it's on the border of that curve, which is inconveniently off the scale here. So it looks like on the 35 to 40 curve, that's the modelled. So it might be modelled to have a contribution of 36, 37 decibels. Is that correct?
I think it might be a little higher than that. I think it might be 37 or 38.
Yeah.
There are tables.
That's the next question.
They're in an appendix.
So that's D15. Just happens to be a convenient one to consider, that's all.
Yeah, D15 is a stakeholder residence, and the predicted level at high wind speeds is 39.
39.
And at low wind speeds is 27.
27. On this curve, what effect would it have to the background noise levels at night time if the wind farm is operating full time, noise levels are full on, 24 hours a day?
Well, although these graphs are useful, they don't provide any indication of the wind speed. And so you took me to an area in the middle of the graph, which showed the noise level at around about 40.
Around about there?
Yes, that's right.
That's what you're saying.
Now,
so that's at high, you think that's higher wind speed?
I'm assuming it is, and
yep.
and I can't say for certain, but that would be a reasonable explanation for that. And if that's the case, and you're predicting a level of 39 at that residence, which is a stakeholder, the level would be, it would make some difference to that background level if the wind is in that direction. but not a significant variation from those levels.
So the green line there would not be affected that much. It might even be flattened out a bit because the backgrounds are more constant.
That's right.
Noise source. That's
Yes.
right. So you said something else there. If it's very low wind speed, the wind farm might not be working. So that's another thing.
Well, let's say 3 metres a second, which is the cut-in wind speed. The predicted level is on one model, in the ISO model, is 27.
So 27 on that one there would bring up the just below the 30 somewhere.
Yes.
So it'll lift up 10 degrees, if that.
Potentially, in circumstances where it's downwind and where those background levels have been measured under a 3 metre a second wind speed, they may be lower, in which case it's below the cutting. They may be higher, but
We don't know.
we don't know. That's right.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, if we could have our time again, it'd be rather good to do something differently. So what I'm trying to envisage here is if you've got an existing very low background noise level, what's the imposition going to be with the wind farm? What's the change in your background noise level, from 20 something to nearly 30? That's 10 decibels. Is that significant?
Well, if you take the level of 30, and then you have the noise level inside, because we're talking about night, that level of 30 would be down to 15 with windows open, down less than 10 inside with windows closed. So those levels are not high noise levels. They're very low noise levels. And so I would say that on the basis of the actual levels, the impact is very low. And the World Health Organization would say that as well, given that they recommend an indoor noise level for sleep at night of 30. These outdoor levels are around about 30, which would be significantly reduced going from outside to inside.
So would these, stop sharing, would this level change be audible?
Yes.
And if you say it drops down to 15 inside, if you've got your window fully open, that's 15 in your bedroom. Would the characteristic of the noise, not just necessarily the level, but the characteristic of the noise, would that be noticeable as well?
Yes, it would be audible and it would be noticeable potentially.
So the change, there's a potential change. Would you regard it as significant? I suppose you've got to have a scale to consider what is significant.
Yes, but in terms of, our expertise is in measuring and predicting noise levels, and we rely on the experts in those fields to tell us what is significant. The World Health Organization says we've got to try to keep the indoor levels below 30. So it's well below those levels.
So below 30 is to maintain sleep, to get to sleep, to stay asleep?
To protect against sleep disturbance. So all of those factors.
So even at the most exposed, I suppose, even at the stakeholder property, you're saying that it would be audible.
It would be audible at those times.
And the characteristic would be noticeable.
Yes.
Just let me have a read of some other questions. Just going back to the model again, was there any terrain screening offered in the model?
Yes, the terrain was included, and a maximum barrier effect of 2 decibels was included, although I doubt that was ever comes into play when you have a source that high and relatively flat land. It just doesn't come into play.
It's just not going to see it, is it?
No.
You mentioned the 2017 measurements. Why did you do them?
They were done because at the time it was thought that the construction might start relatively soon.
All right.
And we wanted to understand the pre-construction rather than, so that we can do a comparison with post-construction.
Okay, just a quick one. The battery, noise from the battery. Are you aware of any impacts of the noise from the batteries?
Look, the batteries are being developed very quickly at the moment. In terms of, there were no real, very few grid scale batteries in place a few years ago. There are now many proposed, and they are evolving. They're beginning to consider noise issues, and so I think the situation will be significantly different by the time this one is installed, and the criteria will be more easily achieved than what we've demonstrated.
And the construction activities, the guidelines are, they're basically saying best practice.
That's right, and also for normal activities at night being inaudible, and that's obviously the most important time. But for wind farms, given the separation distances, you've got a much better opportunity to have, reasonable noise levels for construction than you would in a situation where the construction is much more close to residences.
And the quarry blasting, do you see that as an issue?
Not with the separation distances. It will need to be managed, and I'm not saying we just let it go, but these things are obviously very carefully monitored in terms of when you do blasting, you don't just turn up and blast. These things are designed and assessed by the experts, but given the separation distances to residences, it should be able to be easily achieved.
And the management of blasting from an acoustic point of view would include?
Well, the management of blasting, that's done by the people who do the blasting. They're experts at it. They do their own calculations of what the blast size needs to be to achieve relevant criteria. They do that, they monitor it, and they report on it. It's a very, as you would hope, very heavily regulated area.
And the community management is probably what I was aiming for. Would you say that or recommend that it would be a useful thing for the blasting operator to notify the community when they're doing blasting?
Absolutely, it's very important that they do that. What's often done is that they do that at a particular time each week, so that people are expecting it, and when they hear it, they say, "Okay, well, that's what it is." So, for example, you might do it 1 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, and the time that you might do that, you would try to have a discussion with the community about the best time for that.
And you'd also, I'm thinking maybe direct communication that the nearest, I think there's only one resident that's within the direct impact of the blasting, so maybe they can get a rapport going.
I would hope so. Yes, that's certainly what should occur.
I have no further questions.
Thank you, Member West. Just a couple of questions before we see if there's a re-examination. Ms. Turnbull, have you seen the, excuse me, the without prejudice permit conditions prepared by DILP?
Yes, I have.
Do you have any comment or do you support them?
I do support them, and I think I made that statement in my statement.
Thank you. Just reiterating for my notes.
Thank you. That's fine.
And also the proponent has added without prejudice track changes to the environmental management framework, document 36. You've seen those as well?
To the environmental management framework, I don't think I have seen that.
There's quite a few changes there. I'm not sure if showing them on the screen would be fair. I'll just see if I can share my screen. So there's give it time to have a look at that. Is that large enough?
Yes, I can see that.
I can scroll down once you get to the bottom.
Yes, I've read through those.
I'll just scroll down a bit further. I hope you hit a marker where you were.
No, that's fine.
Yep.
Yes, I've been through those.
So what you've read so far, you have no concerns, or do you support them?
I do support them because they recommend that a construction noise and vibration management plan be implemented. And I think that is the most appropriate way to deal with these things, because at that time you have an understanding of what construction practices are going to be. For example, you know if you're going to need particular bits of equipment and when they need to occur. And so the construction noise and vibration management plan should incorporate all of those things.
Thank you. And this is just the final part of it on the next page. If you have a moment to have a look at those and provide any comment.
Yes, I agree with those.
Okay. Thank you. They're all the questions on the IAP. Mr. Powell, do you have any re-examination?
I do have some re-examination, but I thought I saw that Mr. Fetter has his hand up. So before I do that,
I was going to go to Mr. Fetter after your re-examination, but I can ask now if you like. Mr. Fetter?
Thank you, Chair. I just had one matter to clarify with Mr. Turnbull, if I might, arising out of some of his exchange with Member West. It'll take me 30 seconds.
No, we can't allow that, I'm afraid. We'll have to move.
Can I just explain, and then I'm in your hands? It's just there was
We'll talk about
yesterday.
We'll talk about it after. We just can't revisit any ground after your cross-examination.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you. Mr. Powell.
Mr. Turnbull, in response to questions from Member West, you referred to the South Australian EPA guidelines and the UK Institute of Acoustics guidelines. Can I just share my screen? Just want to make sure that, let's see if the computer's going to do the right thing for me. Bear with me a moment. Where are we? Okay, so this is South Australian EPA Wind Farm Environment and Noise Guidelines. I'll just skip to the next page. You see updated in November 2021. Is that the current version of the South Australian EPA guidelines that you were referring to in response to Member West's question?
Yes, it is.
And if I just scroll down a few pages, I think to about page 10. At the bottom of page 10, you see there's a heading titled Propagation Model. I've highlighted there that it recommends to utilise noise prediction methods in accordance with ISO 9613-2 or CONCAWI.
Would you mind just expanding that a little? It's just very difficult to read.
Yes, of course. Yeah, beg your pardon.
Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
And then there's a reference just above the 3 points I've highlighted. There's a reference to determine an overall protected level and using the following inputs. Now notice the third one is hard ground, which I'll come back to shortly. But the next paragraph refers to section 4.3 of the Institute of Acoustics, a good practice guide to the application of ETSU R97 for the assessment and rating of wind turbine noise. So when you reference the Institute of Acoustics guideline in response to Member West's question, is it that document that you were referring to?
Yes, it was.
And can you see the screen there?
Yes.
That's a good practice guide. It's got the same heading that I've just read out, and it's dated May 2013. And is that the document you're referring to in response to Member West's question?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. And if we scroll down to section 4.3, just move that out of the way. This is really annoying, excuse me. 4.3 is headed Noise Propagation Model Input and Parameters. And paragraph 4.3.4 describes ground factors. And this is one of the topics on which you were questioned by Mr. Fetter and Ms. Member West. Shall I zoom that in so you can read it?
Sorry, I put my glasses on there.
I have the same problem. So there's advice that a soft ground factor of 1 should not be used. What does a soft ground factor of 1 mean?
It essentially means that the ground is completely absorbing any sound that hits it, essentially.
Okay.
This is for the ISO model, I should point out. It's
Yes.
not the Konkawi model.
Not for Konkawi. And although a ground factor of G = 0 is commonly used, as it will tend to provide robust predictions in most situations, this can over-predict noise levels. And for consistency, it is recommended to use a ground factor of G = 0.5. Is this the paragraph or the discussion that you had regard to when you selected using that ground factor in your ISO modelling?
Yes, it is.
Now, yesterday you were also asked questions about, while we're in the document, about receiver height, and it's Mr. Hewson's evidence, I think, that using a receiver height of 4 metres is inappropriate. The questions were put to you about that.
Yes.
But if you see, can you read paragraph 4.3.8 and advise whether it was this receiver height advice that you had regard to in selecting 4 metres in your ISO modelling?
Yes, it was.
All right, thank you. I don't believe these 2 documents have been tabled yet, but I'll table them and distribute them and upload them straight after Mr. Turnbull's evidence. What has been tabled, I believe, by Ms. Tennick is the former South Australian EPA guidelines. And once again, I've got to move this out of the way. I'll zoom in. And I'm just going to scroll to the next page. And you see the date there of July 2009?
Yes.
Now, yesterday, in response to a question from Mr. Fetter about, I think it was about the ground absorption assumption you made, and Mr. Hewson's differing opinion about that in his expert witness statement, you commented that you thought Mr. Hewson might have referred to the old version of the South Australian EPA guidelines. And I think while you're here, it's probably desirable to just take you to that and ask you to comment, because when I go to the discussion of the propagation model on page 10 of the old guidelines, it actually looks, with the exception of the fact that it doesn't refer to the Institute of Acoustics advice, it actually looks the same. There's a reference to a hard grounds factor. So can I just ask you to perhaps amend your evidence if necessary, or otherwise just clarify or elucidate your response to Mr. Fetter's question in light of having the document now in front of you to comment?
Yes, well, I think the question was in relation to what Mr. Hewson had used, and
Yes.
he specifically references this 2009 document,
I see.
which is the superseded document. And I think I tried to refer Mr. Fetter to the 2021 document, which includes the reference to the IOA Good Practice Guide.
All right, thank you. I'll stop sharing for the moment. While we're discussing model inputs and ground factors, Mr. Fetter put to you a question yesterday about ground absorption factors and the reliability or appropriateness of your assumption. And his question, he asked a question specifically related to Orford, noting that it could be covered in concrete, is my note from the question. Can I just show you this? Before I do that, you mentioned in response to questions from Ms. Marshall that you've visited the location on a number of occasions. Have you been to Orford at all or driven through it?
Yes, I have. In fact, I think the community consultation was in Orford.
Okay. So you're familiar with it. So this is, can you see, this is my Google map of the location of Orford. When you undertake ISO modelling, would you typically characterise that type of environment that's on the image and before you and that which you've observed when you visited Orford as being one that's covered in concrete?
No.
And is there any circumstance in which you would consider using a ground absorption factor, a reflective ground absorption factor, such as water or concrete, appropriate in ISO 9613 modelling in this type of environment?
Certainly not in that environment. In fact, you can see there that the path between Orford and where the turbines are includes some what looks to be almost a forest, and that would actually reduce the noise beyond the amount that I've assumed.
Okay. Thank you. Now, just give me a moment. Organise myself. Just going to reshare this screen. Yesterday, do you recall Mr. Fetter, beg your pardon, asking questions of you in relation to Schedule B3 of the New Zealand Standard, the 2010 New Zealand Standard, and its requirements relating to amplitude modulation?
Yes.
And Mr. Fetter asked you a question particularly related to the first sentence of B3.1, which says no appropriate objective test for amplitude modulation has been standardised. And in response to that question, you said, well, that was at the time, but you said that there had been tests developed since the 2010 standard had been prepared. Do you recall that?
Yes.
It might assist the inquiry to understand your evidence about what that amplitude modulation testing is and your opinions about that testing approach, should I say?
Well, the IOA has developed, following a lot of research since 2010, a methodology to objectively assess amplitude modulation from wind farms, and they've put together a recommendation about how that ought to be assessed. I think that this 2010 standard contemplates that that could occur. It has occurred, and it is appropriate to use that methodology now.
Okay. Now, I may not have the right document, but I'll ask you, and if it isn't the right document, we might ask you to supply it. But I have here, I'll just zoom in, a report called Wind Turbine AM Review Phase 2 Report, dated August 2016. Is that the document that you're referring to that deals with AM, or is there another document published by the Institute of Acoustics?
Well, there are two documents.
Yes.
The IOA produced a document which described the methodology to be used, and then this document extends on that to determine the penalties that ought to apply where that modulation is found. So it's a combination of the two documents.
I see. So this document is around the penalty that should be applied if AM is detected, but the other document you're referring to is the testing methodology to establish whether AM is there or not.
That's correct.
All right. So what we might ask is for Mr. Turnbull to provide that to us and we'll table it. Thank you. Look, we'll table this document as well because I'll make submissions on it in due course. I'll just see if there's anything else. Oh yeah, I'll stop sharing. I just want to ask, finally, in response to a question from Mr. Fetter yesterday about the New Zealand standards approach to on-off testing. My note of your response is that there can be challenges with on-off testing. It's not a bad way, but it has its limitations. I'm just wondering, before we let you go, if you would be able to just assist the inquiry by understanding what your opinions are about the limitations of on-off testing, but also what its benefits are and the circumstances in which it might be beneficial.
Certainly. Well, I suppose one of the downsides and one of the main downsides is that it's a moment in time and doesn't necessarily tell you over time what the variation might be or what circumstances might be. Now that time can be used for you can try to look at the forecast to make sure that time is a particular meteorological condition, which is important. And the circumstances where you might do that is that if you do longer term testing, you find something that is not conclusive for a particular wind speed and wind direction, you might consider, well, let's do the on-off testing for that condition to confirm compliance or otherwise under that meteorological condition.
Okay. All right, thank you. I have no further questions on re-examination.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Appreciate you returning today and for your time. May be excused.
Thank you.